Hi, I'm Nate Bresnow, and this is my presentation that I'm giving a little bit later today at Cornell University. I'm pre-recording the presentation because it will not be recorded when I give the talk live, and in case any of you miss it, this is my public science contribution. The talk I'm giving today is about reproducibility in the social and behavioral sciences, with a specific deep dive into implications for sociology. The results I will be presenting are from the SCORE project, Systematizing Confidence in Open Research and Evidence. This very large project was funded by DARPA and hosted at the Center for Open Science and was led by Brian Nosek, although it had many contributors. Recently, an issue of Nature published 3 studies from the SCORE project, and these 3 studies were large-scale, many analysts studies that looked at reproducibility, whether numerical results could be computationally reproduced, robustness, whether given alternative plausible specifications, a result held, and replicability, if the results held with a new sample. There are more aspects to the project that I won't be talking about today that have to do with humans versus machines in assessing credibility and doing replicability. This gives you a sense of also why DARPA might be really interested in this type of research. Here are the 6 papers. Again, the top 3 are published in Nature in a recent issue, and then the other 3 are presumably forthcoming. Today's talk is going to focus especially on computational reproducibility. So let me give you the study design for the SCORE project on computational reproducibility. They got together a sample that was representative of social and behavioral science disciplines of 62 journals. These were essentially top journals known to be top ranked or highly respected, and also journals that were known to publish quantitative method research, so research with statistical tests. And what they did is they identified 3,000 papers with statistical tests in the period 2009 to 2018. 2018 is when the SCORE project started. And then what they did is they took a somewhat random sample of all these papers to be representative of various disciplines. It wasn't purely random because some papers didn't pass certain eligibility checks. And what they were left with was 600 papers for their target sample that they would try to engage in computational reproducibility. So then they checked if there was data and replication materials available for these 600 papers. And they found that in 146 papers, there was. An important caveat is that the smallest unit of analysis in this research is the claim level. There are multiple claims in many papers. And so what they would do is they would identify the main claims in each paper for testing. And that was 553 claims in these 146 papers. And then they got together many analysts, so they crowdsourced the project and had an open call for contributors, and they got 114 analysts, and they engaged in a computational reproduction using the provided data and any other materials. I was one of those many analysts, so that's how I came into the project. We put together the results, and everyone was invited to give feedback on the paper. We then submitted the paper to Nature and got an R&R. And the R&R rightfully pointed out that if we're going to talk about computational reproducibility, we certainly should be looking at journal policies, as this would play a role, or we expect it to play a role. And so then they asked for volunteers to engage in this follow-up study. And I was also one of those volunteers. And what we did is we got all of the journal policies and how they evolved since 2003 for these 62 journals. And then they asked for someone or someones to run a bunch of additional analyses using the new data and to produce several figures. And that was also where I contributed, actually by myself, and produced several tables and figures that are in the supplementary materials and one that appears in the main text. So the SCORE study wanted to check for process reproducibility. Process reproducibility means that the study has available data. A study is minimally reproducible if the data are available. Ideally, of course, there's code and other materials to support in a replication. And what I'm focusing on here today is author-provided data. That means that there's data on the journal website, some kind of link, some kind of online repository, or if not, that when directly asked via email, the author provided some kind of replication package or data. This is important because in cases that there were no data, analysts tried to reconstruct the data in cases for studies using secondary publicly available data. But this is not process reproducibility. This is something else. So let's look at first results about data and code availability. This is at the paper level. And we can see by discipline that there's quite a lot of variation. Political science and economics are the highest. They have the highest levels of process reproducibility, over 50%. Around 50% for economics and over 50% for political science. And the dark blue bars indicate that a large portion of process reproducibility includes code sharing. Sociology is much lower. 11.4% had author-provided data, and only a tiny fraction of those included any code. Psychology was marginally better than sociology, but nothing compared to political science and economics. Sociology was similar to business, and education was by far the worst. So now let's look at the computational reproducibility. There are three outcomes. Precisely reproduce means that all numerical outcomes are identical to the original. Approximately reproduce means that all of the outcomes are within 15% of the original numerical finding, and at least one is not precise. Not reproduce means neither of the above categories applies. This does, however, leave some studies where all claims were precisely reproduced, but one was not even approximately reproduced, or studies that were close and in the same direction. We do need to be careful, though. This is a complicated study. The reproduction attempt occurs at the claim level. So the many analysts, were asked to reproduce claims. Most papers have multiple claims, and therefore some form of inferential, in order to have inferential statistics, we need some form of weighting. For example, a paper with 5 claims but only one with available reproduction data is weighted as 0.2 papers, meaning that that gets entered into the sample as an additional 0.2 papers. So let's look at that a little bit. Sociology had 79 eligible papers, but only 23 with materials sufficient for reproduction. And then in the end, only 21 had completed reproductions, meaning that in 2 cases, what we thought were sufficient materials were actually not sufficient for a reproduction. Of those 21 papers, in those 21 papers, there were 53 claims. But because of, again, data availability per claim, number of claims and weighting, this actually amounted to only 9 papers when weighted to the paper level. So we have to think carefully about this. And if you look into the paper, you may notice what appear to be discrepancies in statistics. And this is almost always the case, that it's the difference between the paper level statistics and claim level statistics. And sometimes they appear both in the same figure. So just sort of a disclaimer when looking into the study. So let's look at general computational reproducibility in the SCORE study. on the top bar, the top stacked bar, you can see that for studies where data and code were available, 88.1% were at least approximately reproducible, and about 75% precisely reproducible. So a really high rate of computational reproducibility. The second bar, for studies where only data was available, 75% approximate reproducibility with below 50% precise reproducibility. When there was no data available, it was much worse, 32.9% with below 15% being precise. So now if we break that down by discipline, we see how sociology fares, and it doesn't fare too well. So if we look at sociology, it's just over 50% computational reproducibility, with precise reproducibility down around 1/4 or 25%. Now on the left, we can see percent attempted. This is at the claims level. So of all of the claims, very few were attempted as replications, as reproductions, because there was no available data. Now you may remember that at the paper level, there was only 11.4% of papers with author-provided data. But actually the number of claims were a smaller percentage of sociology, and this is important to keep in mind. So let me just summarize the conclusions from the SCORE study. Reproducibility is precarious. Only 1/4 of the social and behavioral science studies in the sample from 2009 to 2018 shared their data. Of these 1/4, about 50%, about half, were reproducible at the precise level. Now that may sound okay, but only 17.5% of all studies were even just approximately reproducible when we count those without data as not reproducible. And that's a fair way to count them, because there is literally no way to check if they are reproducible if there's no data. Okay, so now let's see how the SCORE study fares in comparison to other studies that investigated computational reproducibility. This is important because being published in Nature, this is very likely to become the go-to citation in computational reproducibility, and it's good to vet the findings to see if they fit with our prior studies and fit with our priors. So there's an important study by Hardwick et al. That looked at 35 papers in the journal Cognition that had data available or that they could find, and 37% had at least one effect not statistically reproducible within 10%, so a somewhat similar criteria to the SCORE study. So that means that 63% were reproducible. And that is in the direction of the SCORE study results, where data were available, 75% were reproducible. Chang and Lee and Gertler et al. Looked at studies where data was not always available and looked at the computational reproducibility, and the rates were between 14 and 43%. This matches okay with the SCORE studies, finding that for studies without data, the reproducibility rate was really low, close to 1/4, down towards 1/4. However, there were studies with data, so this is actually quite low. So they were a bit below. Now, in terms of sharing behavior, a recent study by Kramer, Schechtele, and Augsburg in Royal Society Open Science recently, looked at all studies using European social survey data. A lot of these were in sociology and political science. And of all these studies, they found that 35% of the authors shared their code. Basically, they all shared their data because European social survey data are all publicly available. But 35% shared their code, and of those with the code sharing, 51% were numerically reproducible. But because of the lack of sharing, the overall exact reproducibility rate is 18%. Nicole Jans looked at the American Journal of Political Science's first year after they instituted mandatory reproducibility checks, and the first 15 accepted papers failed. And it even took an average of something like 2 interactions with the authors to achieve numerical reproducibility. In many cases, the code simply didn't run. And then there are several other studies that document data access problems, lack of sharing, and reproduction failures in social and political sciences. So in general, the SCORE study fits well within the canon of other studies. It does not seem like some kind of outlier. So let's talk about how things have been changing over time. They're getting better, that's clear, at least from an open science and transparency perspective. And here you have the figure representing the work from the team that I worked with on the R&R for Nature. So again, a reminder, 88.1% of studies that shared data and code were approximately reproducible. So really high reproducibility rate dependent on data and code sharing. And during this time period, extended a bit, journal policies have changed dramatically. So in 2003, none of the 62 journals had any data requirement policy. Data requirement policy means that it's actually enforced, not just we require that you share data and then nobody does it, or we recommend that you share data. During the period under study, from 2008, it climbed from 2009, excuse me, it climbed. And if you look at 2025, we see that 50% of journals have data requirements, data sharing requirements. And almost as many also include a code sharing requirement. So it's very rare that a data sharing requirement exists alone today. It goes along with a code sharing requirement. And almost 20% actually check for computational reproducibility. So this is really becoming the norm, but it varies very much by discipline. And I'm going to come to that in a minute. But just another strong reminder how important this transparency is and why this change is really good news for the reproducibility of social science and sociology. So I have a study that I conducted with Eike Mark-Rinke and Alexander Wuttke, and that was recently published. And we got together many analysts, and there were 88 independent replications of the same study. And these were computational reproductions. And we had a split design. So a random half got the replication materials, data, code, and what they needed to do that. And the other half got nothing, just the paper. And so those with the materials, 77% did an exact reproduction, similar in the direction of the SCORE study. And those without, 48%. So this transparency makes a huge difference. And Abel Brodeur got together a many analyst study, and they looked at 110 recently published articles in economics and political science journals. What was really important about this study is they looked only at journals with mandatory data and code sharing policies, and they got 85% plus computational reproduction. Again, it depends how stringent you are with your rounding and decimal places. But this is also representative of SCORE and a reminder of the importance of transparency. So again, coming to variation across discipline, sociology is at 0. It was at 0 in 2003, and it's still at 0 today. Well, I didn't check exactly today, but at least by the end of 2025, none of these journals that were in the SCORE study have a mandatory data sharing policy. Political science is really high, almost 78%. Economics is next, and psychology is somewhat strong, and then the rest are lagging far behind. So my thinking was, okay, we know about the transparency norms, and that is obviously playing a big role here in the reproducibility of sociology. But how representative of sociology is this sample? And so if you remember, there were 3,000 papers with statistical tests, but only 600 were investigated. And so sociology had 515 papers in this original 3,000 sample, and 79 were investigated for data sharing. But what about the other 436? It is possible that it was bad luck in the somewhat random sampling of those 79 papers in sociology. And another question is, how are things changing over time? And those are two things I'd like to explore a little bit, and I have explored a little bit in the past week in more of a quick and dirty analysis to see if it's worth pursuing these research questions. So what I did was I wanted to extract all the sociology and political science studies and then prompt Gemini, so Gen AI, in this case, Gemini 3.1 Pro web version paid tier. And I wanted it to do some agent work for me to find those articles that were from the SCORE study but not investigated, check those articles if they have shared data and replication materials, and also check within the full text of the articles if there's some kind of statement, like sometimes authors will write data available upon request or replication materials available upon request. And then, of course, have some human checking. So I did a somewhat random sample check for accuracy of these articles. I say somewhat because there were a couple articles that I wanted in particular to look at, but otherwise just whatever came at the top of the list I took a look at. So let's look at the results. In the top part of the slide is the untested sample of papers. So in sociology, that's 436 papers. Now the agentic LLM found data for 70 of those papers, 16%. And when counting a statement in the paper or somewhere that said data available upon request or some kind of replication materials available upon request, this jumped to 39%. Interestingly, political science looks basically identical. 466 papers in political science, 68 were found by the LLM to have data. And that was 15%, and that jumped to 35% if you count those statements found usually in the paper. So the question then is, how is that possible? There was such a huge discrepancy. So if you look down at the lower part of the slide, in the original study with humans trying to get the reproduction data, of 79 sociology papers, they found only 23 or 29%. And of 85 political science papers, they found 50 or 59%. So a huge difference, something very different than what the LLM found for the untested sample. Now, one of the big reasons for the difference is that during the period of 2009 to 2018, sociologists simply didn't share their data online. Journals didn't have places where you could post the data. It just wasn't a thing. It's just not what they were doing. Only one of the 23 data sharing studies was found immediately online by the SCORE researchers. 22, so more than 99% of the studies, the data was found through contact with the author. So the author said either, here's my data, or hey, your internet search missed my professional website or something, it's posted there. And that was completely different to political science, where 39% already had the data online somewhere. And you can think of part of the reason why. American Journal of Political Science, 2015, requires data, requires computational reproducibility. So the data is going to always be there from 2015 on, and the norms in political science were changing rapidly at this time, so that sharing data had already become a thing. So what did the LLM find for these same studies? Well, actually, it found something similar to the untested sample. 20 to 27% of the cases, so actually even a little bit higher rate, it found data. And then this jumps up to like 40 or 40+% if you count statements within the text. So now the question is, okay, is the LLM like hallucinating, or what's happening here? So let's interrogate the results of the LLM a little bit to see if it's at all reliable. First, if you look to the left, in the two boxes. The blue box is sociology. There's an agreement rate between the LLM and the original human researchers of about 50%. Now, we wouldn't expect it to be too high because remember, most of the sociology studies were found through direct contact, so through emailing, and that's what the LLM will not be finding here. Political science is similar, it's close to 50% in the orange box on the left. So let's look specifically at studies where the original and the LLM are not in agreement. So if you look here, starting with the left column are sociology studies. And if you look at this top one, this was interesting. This was a study that was replicated, reproduced in the SCORE study, and then the replicators posted their results online. So the LLM found this and thought, oh, look, that's a replication package. So this is basically a false positive. If we look at the next study, the data appeared on ICPSR, I think after the original study was published. So it's just the data. This is sort of a gray area. This could be considered data availability. Whether this is really author shared data, it's not clear. It would require some more investigation. But here's one, and the third one, this study was posted later on the Dataverse, so after it was published. So the author went back and decided that they would make their data available when it wasn't before. And who knows, maybe that was prompted by being contacted by SCORE and not having the data ready. And then, I mean, this can take some time. So if someone contacts you and asks you for your replication materials and you don't have them ready, you may not be able to get them ready within even a few months if there's a lot of projects running. There are several cases where it's just not found. So the LLM seems to have hallucinated or picked up on something that isn't there. And here's one example. In this study, there were supplementary materials and they were on the journal's website, but they were actually just tables and some more text. And it seems like the LLM may have thought these supplementary materials were some form of data sharing on the journal website. And then, of course, the other way around, when the original study had data sharing and the LLM didn't find it, this seems perfectly plausible that the authors then, they replied to emails with the data. So it's okay. I have not coded all the studies. I did about 15 per discipline. The results suggest that the LLM does okay, which in a way suggests that in 2026, sociology and political science are not so different, and that back then, at least, part of the difference can be attributed to responding to emails. So the political science researchers had replication packages ready, or were more willing to, or were more willing to share. So let's recap. Are sociologists' data sharing behaviors at parity with political science? It's unclear. In 2018, political scientists had way more data online than sociologists. That's clear, and that's still true of these studies today. I went and looked at several of the studies. You don't find online data at the journal websites, at least for sociology. It doesn't really exist during this period of 2009 to 2018. But in 2018, or around 2018, political scientists more often had a replication package ready or were more willing to respond to requests for sharing it. Whether that's true today needs to be, of course, investigated. Sociology studies published before 2018 didn't have data online, as I just said. It was less than 1% in the study, but the case numbers are small, so let's just say 5% to be in an error margin. But by 2026, this jumped to 27% for those same studies with some kind of moderate reliability, not super strong, but moderate. So based on what we know from the original study, this 27% will be an underestimation. Maybe 40% is more likely if we count personal websites or email communications, things that the LLM couldn't find or know about. So it could be at parity with political science. It could have been a little bit of a bad luck sample. Again, although many of those studies simply don't have data after checking and the LLM got it wrong. So more research is necessary here, but it seems to be a potentially productive avenue for future research. So just real quick, I don't want to forget about the other two studies that were published in this same issue of Nature, looking at robustness and replicability. Regarding robustness, Sociology had 10 or less papers, again, depending on how you weight these things. It was not enough for discipline-specific findings, unfortunately. But replicability, Sociology did as well as the other disciplines. So Sociology fared well. If you look at the paper level, Sociology is 51.5% replicability. That's the same test or experiment with a new sample. Economics, 42.5, political science, 52. Relatively similar range. If you look at the claims level, it shifts a little, but again, relatively similar range. Sociology, 45%, economics, 47%, political science, a bit higher, 66%. So a question that I try to think about is, why wouldn't we share data in sociology? What would be a good argument for not sharing data in sociology? Now, I want to immediately exclude any arguments about like, oh, qualitative researchers should make all of their transcripts open or something like that. In many cases, they don't have permission to do that in advance. And in many cases, it could put their subjects in danger. There's other cases with quantitative researchers where they have data that's protected. You know, they had to go through certain stages to get access to that data, and they are not allowed legally to share that data. This is not what I'm talking about here. The question is, when we otherwise have data that we could legally and ethically share, why wouldn't we share it? And here I come to a comparison of two really important scholars in sociology and political science. Andrew Abbott in sociology, who's the editor of the American Journal of Sociology, and one of the more prolific sociologists in recent times, wrote many, many, many books and many papers, and just played a huge role in sociology from the 90s through the 2010s, let's say. Gary King, a similar time frame, political science, very important, a little bit more in the direction of methods. But let's look at two papers from these two scholars. And in one of them, we find arguments, at least from Andrew Abbott, super important sociologist, why data sharing or code sharing might not be good. And in his Notes on Replication, published in 2007 in Sociological Methods and Research, he argues that like a lack of clarity or having hidden code mistakes is a good thing, or could be a good thing, because it could lead us to discover new truths. I put that in quotes. The concept he's trying to express here is that we might get some interesting findings if we make mistakes. And his argument is that that could lead us to discovery. But I'm very skeptical of what he means here by discovery. I think what I understand it to mean is we could get some interesting publications, and we could get, we could have provocative findings that get integrated into sociology and get cited, but they'll be based on mistakes. They'll be totally unreliable. In the same paper, he argues that replicationism will make us sterile and more like economics. Okay, so those are the arguments against. And with someone so prominent making these kinds of arguments on maybe a regular basis, it could have influenced the norms in sociology. Gary King, on the other hand, 1994 already, he is on replication, and he is telling political science that replication is really essential, that we need it desperately, and that it's the way forward for the discipline. And how do we know that we have knowledge of anything in the first place? And he says replication, replication. So to summarize, there is a lack of open science norms in sociology. Sociology journals especially are a source of this. There's a wholesale lack of enforced transparency policies. There is a translocational reproducibility factor. It is changing fast. And we've seen from my quick and dirty results that sociologists' behaviors are changing, and it's probably coming from the ground up. And also we know that there's a lot of funding agencies that are from the top down pushing reproducibility. So the journals really seem to be a key problem at the moment. One reason that scholars might be hesitant, and especially when there's not a norm in sociology, is the fear of the so-called replication police, so that if they share their data, they're going to be replicated and proven to be wrong or something along those lines. And so they, in sociology, they may feel that they have nothing to gain or maybe even something to lose because replication is just not popular. And so just as a quick tidbit of information here at the end, in my paper, Does Sociology Need Open Science? I was looking at Retraction Watch, the database of all retracted papers, and sociology doesn't really do retractions. There are just a couple, and they seem to have been something unethical taking place, or possibly a beef between some co-authors. Also, there's just not replications in sociology. Prior to 2020, there's less than 40 replications in the top sociology journals. And a bulk of them happened like in the 90s or 80s. Philip Cohen likes to track these things. He's a big advocate of open science. And in a recent blog post, he was pointing out that the recent volume of the American Sociological Review, 2/3 of those using quantitative methods had replication materials. That's very strong. That's political science strong. And that's a big difference from just a couple years ago, where it was close to 1/4. So with that, hopefully positive note, I thank you for your attention today. And if you didn't get a chance to hear my talk, I provide you with the slides and wish you well.